and welcome to the Talking Crop podcast. My name is Catherine Seabrook, and I'm a commercial agriculture educator with University of Illinois Extension serving Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. Talking Crop is a row crop production podcast with episodes occurring every other week during the growing season between May and September. In each episode, I bring on a guest speaker to discuss topics related to their areas of expertise. In today's episode, I'm joined by Jonathan Koppes and Andrew Hockenberry. Jonathan is a professor of agricultural policy and the director of the Gardner Agriculture Policy Program in the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and Andrew is a postdoctoral research associate in the ACE department. We discuss the policy behind carbon markets, what its flaws are, and what could be done differently to promote better carbon market policy. In the episode description, you'll find links to Jonathan's and Andrew's paper on carbon markets, as well as links to some carbon market guides for farmers. For the next episode of Talking Crop, I'll be joined by Laura Gentry, the Director of Water Quality Research with Illinois Corn. We'll be discussing the economics of agricultural conservation, and that episode will air on Wednesday, September 2nd. And now, please enjoy this episode of Talking Crop, the Policy of Carbon Markets, with Jonathan Koppes and Andrew Hockenberry. Hello, Jonathan, and hello, Andrew. Welcome, both of you, to the Talking Crop podcast. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
So I am first going to have you both introduce yourselves. So if you could provide a little bit of your guys' background and what your current roles are at the university.
Sure, I'll start it off. I am a postdoctoral research associate in the College of Agriculture, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Illinois. And before that role, I was a law student at Vermont Law.
I'm Jonathan Koppes. I'm the Gardner Associate Professor of Agricultural Policy and Law at the University of Illinois in the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics, where, like Andrew, my formal training's in law. I'm not an economist. We like to argue with them, right, Andrew? So that's our role. I do a lot of work with the Farm Doc Project and other sort of public-facing efforts on agricultural policy, farm policy. Did some time in D.C. working on these things and have really kind of had this wonderful opportunity to get into researching a lot of questions and issues that I encountered in D.C. And so it's including things like working with Andrew on just sort of how do we understand this better? What are the contexts and issues around this, some of the policy topics? So that's a lot of what I get to do.
Yeah, and policy is exactly what we're going to be talking about today, which is a little bit of a shift away from what I normally speak with guests on the podcast for. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about the policy behind agricultural carbon markets. And for reference, a lot of our conversation is going to be centered around your guys' article that you put out with your co-author, Brian Endres, which is Aligning Quality Assurance for Agricultural Carbon Credits with Farm Bill Conservation. This is in the Northern Illinois University Law Review, which I'll admit I thought I was going to be daunted by reading it at first because anything law related, I figured I'd totally not understand, but it's a really fascinating read and very easy to read in comparison to what I thought it was going to be. But that's kind of what we're going to center our conversation on today, which is again, that policy, specifically looking at it as it relates to Farm Bill conservation. But to kind of set the stage, I wondered what motivated you guys and your co-author to write about this and research this specific policy topic.
I can jump in and take that. It all began with a research project led by Chloe Wardropper here at College of ACES at U of I. And she's put together just a pretty broad group of researchers, multidisciplinary, kind of a lot of what maybe we expect land grant research to do. Here's an issue of our time. Here's an issue around not just climate change issues, but the contracting and a lot of the sort of how farmers manage it and deal with it. And so our role is one piece tucked within this bigger research project. And so that's how it comes about. And then I had the privilege of having Andrew in a class that I taught in the summer up at Vermont Law and Graduate School, and so we convinced him to come to Illinois for a little while to work on this project in a postdoc role. And he can talk a little bit maybe more about kind of that research team that he's been embedded in as the resident lawyer.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Catherine, for your kind words about the article. When you read the title back, I was like, oh man, that does sound pretty dense and dry. But yeah, it's been a great opportunity to work with Chloe and the rest of the team. Yeah, it's very cross-disciplinary. I'm working right now with a couple of social scientists at SUNY College up in New York on consumer interpretations of these climate marketing claims that you see on products and in the airline industry and things like that. So it covers a broad space in the carbon market world.
Sure. And so I was hoping you guys could talk about, this is very basic information here to set things up, but what is a carbon market? And also with that, kind of the background of them, like how did they come to be? And then how did agriculture become such an important aspect to carbon markets?
Yeah, so a lot of it started in the early 1990s with the International Panel on Climate Change and sort of the call to inventory greenhouse gas sources and sinks. And as I'm sure you know, agriculture can be both a source and a sink of carbon. And so the idea of a carbon market is to sequester carbon. Farmers can alter their practices, their land management practices, their tillage, planting cover crops, things like that to sequester more carbon in the soil. And then there's third-party quantifiers that will quantify how much carbon they sequester, and they can then sell those carbon credits. They get credits for X amount of carbon sequestered into the soil, and then sell those carbon credits and have that as another source of revenue for their farm. It's sort of the basic structure of it. We're in this project really focused on the voluntary carbon markets, which operates independent of government regulations. And so there's compliance carbon markets, which don't really exist in the U.S. There are actually 4, some at the state and regional level, where the state government, so California, for instance, has a compliance market where specific emitters, greenhouse gas emitters, are limited on the amount of carbon they can release into the atmosphere. And one way of allowing that is for them to buy and sell carbon credits. Yeah, there's also a compliance market within aviation and within specific industries, but on the federal level, there is no compliance market. And so this project is really looking at voluntary carbon markets. And I think it's also important to point out here that for farmers and for agricultural producers, it's always on a voluntary basis. They are never having to limit the amount of carbon or to maximize the amount of sequestration that they do. They can sign up for or contract with carbon registries if they want to, or not if they don't. So it's always voluntary for producers.
And in reading the article, you talk about kind of the reasoning behind why there isn't this federal compliance carbon market sort of situation. And I wondered, do you think we ever will see a compliance market, or is it strictly always probably going to remain on a voluntary basis. And I know it could provide different nuance depending on the sector, right? Like you talked about aviation and then agriculture. But do you think we'll ever see more of that regulation, or probably not?
I would say definitely not. Yeah, I don't know if Jonathan, if you have more thoughts.
Andrew, I would have thought you were going to be the optimist and I would be the pessimist in this. Obviously in the short term, not. There's, but I think two things that, Catherine, in your question that jump out to me, one may be sector dependent, right? And so we think of, depending on things, and I'll use an example farmers are very familiar with, like the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard, and those efforts. And so that's a mandate on the transportation fuel industry to blend biofuels. So there's a situation in which it could be, and what is more concerning is what kind of catastrophic set of problems would trigger the federal legislative response, because that our history of this policy tends to be in reaction to really bad events, like how we got into the environmental movement in the 70s. So there is that chance, or certain sectors obviously could be regulated, and then that opens that market opportunity to look for credits and trading credits and buying credits and that sort of thing. So I think Andrew's right in terms of actually mandating a set of compliance provisions on farmers and on the agriculture sector. It's really hard to see that ever coming to pass, and in large part just because of the difficulties of doing so. We see it throughout environmental regulation, like the challenges with hundreds of millions of acres and so forth. The regulatory structure is oftentimes a really difficult fit for that. But it's possible. I think some sectors could see it, and that would have that kind of market generating effect, if you will, like catalyzing, the search for more.
Sure. And something, as I was reading through kind of the information about carbon markets as a whole, and something I've always thought when I consider carbon markets is the very basic premise behind it is that, these companies, they are emitting CO2 and they need to offset that, right? And they can either offset it by releasing less CO2, or they can purchase these credits that will offset it instead. And some of that offsetting is that it's being outsourced, like in our case, to farmers, right, for doing these different practices that reduce carbon. And when it comes to CO2 being released by a factory, from what I understand, it's more easily quantifiable. But when it comes to quantifying, let's say, how much carbon is sequestered by cover cropping for X number of years, that can't be as easily quantifiable. And so is there any information out there, and this could be maybe a question for soil scientists, right? But is there any research out there that does that measurement to kind of ensure that it is like a 1-for-1 ratio, or does that not really exist?
Yeah, there is not really. And that's part of what the Carbon Farming Integrity Project that Jonathan and I are part of is looking at, seeing how much sort of trust there is in the science, and it's a lot of uncertainty around it now with actually quantifying it. But then also, like, our article sort of introduces these realities of agriculture, and that not only are they not able to quantify it, but they're not able to guarantee that it will be stored in the soil indefinitely and lead to permanent removals of CO2 in the atmosphere or things like that. And so, yes, there is a lot of uncertainty within these markets, and it's tricky for sure.
Yeah, and I'm sure working on agronomy and other things, you've got a good grasp of a lot of this is you have to have a model to kind of produce estimates and project what it will do. So it is not an easy. It's not like a tailpipe or a smokestack that you can readily deal with. And so there are a lot of those additional challenges in this sort of agricultural carbon market space, or the goals to do that. And it opens a lot of opportunities for policy, like how policies could be shaped to really kind of benefit that rough connection, from a market standpoint, right? If you're buying credits in a corporate office, you're going to want to have a lot of certainty and be able to, count them in very kind of clear and transparent ways, probably. And as we all know, agriculture's, it doesn't work as simple as a smokestack. And so there are real challenges, and the modeling has it's made amazing leaps and bounds in our ability to model and kind of get a sense of this, but it's still going to be, a rough approximation or estimate of it. And, again, my argument would be that this is where policy to help both the farmer and kind of ease those set of market challenges would be really beneficial. And this is, I'll throw in a little bit about this as well, since thinking in terms of soils and, a lot of these practices that reduce or sequester or considered to help with greenhouse gas emissions are going to help multiple things on the farm and the natural resource base. So it is possible to set this up to where, the carbon piece of it might be one aspect, but, we think cover crops, for example, is going to, that growing cover crop in an otherwise bare and fallow soil is going to do a lot of good, some of which would be drawing down carbon dioxide as the green plant grows. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity as we think this through and we understand kind of where the hurdles are to certain things like this with agriculture and climate credit type markets. Like, okay, so we know there's challenges with weather and uncertainty and risk, but we also know these practices have other benefits. So we can think about a policy that really packages up, like, here's how farmers can, make changes on the field and in their systems. And from that, there may be some, quantifiable estimate of what is a credit for the market or potential market.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, because sometimes I've heard it said, that some producers, they're skeptical of it or can be skeptical of it for a number of reasons. One of which being it's kind of that ideology of, well, if they need to reduce their CO2 emissions, why should I be doing that for them? But I've also heard a counter argument of, well, if you're going to get paid for it anyway, then you may as well do it. And to your point that you were just explaining, that there are other, additional benefits beyond just that, getting that carbon credit potentially. But with that, related to this, there are producers who have been conservationists for a number of years. They've been doing these practices. And with what you guys describe in the paper, there are different limitations to these practices that can actually, in a sense, penalize those producers who were early adopters or are early adopters. Can you explain that in the context of how the carbon markets kind of elicit that concern?
Sure. Yeah. That is one of the main drivers of the paper was this concept of additionality within the carbon markets. And whenever a farmer wants to join, there's a couple requirements. There's several requirements to make sure that the carbon credit that they generate is what they call high quality. So for a carbon credit to be high quality, it has to be additional, permanent, and avoid things like leakage, which are all really sort of like technical terms, but additionality is sort of the main obstacle for farmers that have already started some of these practices, because if they've already started these practices, then they're already sequestering carbon. And when they sign up for to join a carbon market, a voluntary carbon market, their practices that they've been doing for years or decades will not be considered additional because they've already been doing them. And so that is sort of the penalty, if you will, for early adopters of conservation practices is that they may not be able to tap into these extra revenue streams or additional markets because they made the right choices early on. And that's just not sound policy in our view. Is we want to encourage more adoption and encourage adopters to continue those practices. And in some ways, when you set this parameter, when the registries set the standard of additionality, they're not only penalizing early adopters, but they're encouraging revision or reversion to practices that don't sequester carbon or that are more detrimental to soil health. And so we want a policy that honors the dedication of early adopters and also doesn't encourage them to go back to more destructive land management practices.
So, and maybe I should have waited for this question for the end, but why? I mean, when we're talking about this, we all have an idea about agriculture, right? And how it works. And you guys are making very great points about this additionality conundrum. So why is it that the policy doesn't reflect that or has never considered reflecting that? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it economics? What is it? What is that barrier that prevents that being something that's being included? Or is that too big of a question?
I'm laughing. I'm biting my tongue to this whole additionality discussion because Andrew and I have gone around and he's heard my frustrations with this concept for agriculture, right? Additionality makes sense in the smokestack case. Like I put on a new scrubber or I do this thing that's new and different. In agriculture, every year you're doing, right? Like it is a really tough concept. So kind of to your question, Catherine, I think is one of these well-intentioned ideas, like it's one of those well-intentioned things in environmental policy where it's like, okay, we're trying to make this work, but there's a missing kind of adaptation and understanding for agriculture. And I think that's really particularly row crop field-based agriculture where you just have so many uncertainties and such a broad landscape. So I think that's part of it. And this is one of the challenges of a pure market setup in this, I would argue, is that obviously if you're buying something, you want to know what that is. Whereas policy and we think about conservation policy and the efforts to help farmers with it, but we're not. We have a sense that adopting and implementing certain practices are going to have benefits, and so it isn't that market sort of certainty. And additionality, obviously, in addition to being well-intentioned from an environmental standpoint, is also, kind of a driving interest of any company spending money on a credit. They want to be able to say, well, but for us, right? But for this credit, this would not have happened. But we run into this, and agriculture is not exclusive. Like some of the forestry and reforestry things we see in some of these conversations also struggle. How do you know that you prevented trees from being cut down or, those sort of things. And so this is one of those areas, that I think, my argumentative personality aside, I think is a driver for conversations in this policy space to think about how do we get creative and innovative to make this work better in an agricultural setting, incorporating and understanding the risks. And again, Andrew made this point so well that it's almost head scratching to think about. Like one of the unintended consequences of additionality might be I've been doing conservation for 5 years. Well, I'm going to go up and tear it all up so I can go and be additional. That's the worst thing that could happen. Like you really don't want that. And so I think it's just it's one of these areas that I think needs to be highlighted for agriculture specifically in these conversations, and really emphasize that this is a challenge. This is a place where we got to get a little more creative and think it through. But it's it's not an easy topic. It really is. I think, again, it's where we see this kind of inability to take the blueprints from a smokestack and a tailpipe and try to deal with a farm field.
I think it's just fascinating that if agriculture is an industry, and even forestry, like you mentioned, if these are industries that are going to be heavily relied upon, the fact that these concepts and these ideas weren't fully hashed out before these things were implemented is very interesting. And related to that, what's even further interesting is, something that comes in and even further muddies the waters that you guys explain in your paper is conservation programs that are, put out by the government. And the government is also, one of the players we talked about before in terms of potentially trying to set these carbon markets. So can you describe basically what you described in your paper, that at the same time as these carbon markets were kind of trying to be implemented, at the same exact time, we also have conservation programs being implemented that have made it even further difficult for producers to enter into a carbon market contract?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to pass it to Jonathan actually for the agricultural conservation policy section, but it started even before the idea of carbon markets, and so it's just another sort of issue with like timing and additionality is that a lot of these programs started with the 85 Farm Bill, and so they're long running programs.
Yeah, well, as tempting as it is to bore everybody with history and policy, I won't go down that path with you today, Catherine. But I'm always, if you need a boring history conversation, I'm always here for that. But Andrew's
Fair
right,
enough.
and that's where this additionality thing is a challenge, right? We've been we've been helping farmers, not enough, and not enough farmers get the assistance and so forth. But we've been doing this in some form or fashion really since '85, and so to have taxpayer dollars invest in these practices, and then if we had to rip, you can imagine the frustration if you were ripping those up to get additionality in the carbon credit space. So it's again it's an example and a reminder that fitting this into agriculture, right? You can't make agriculture fit into this other type of system. To bring this into agriculture, we're going to have to make it fit within agriculture, which means working alongside these policies and programs and thinking through, how that works. The additionality question being the sort of shining example of that. But we our conservation programs, everything from the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a 10-year contract to take those acres out of production, put it in grass or trees. The carbon sequestration, benefits of that are pretty obvious, and it's probably the most direct fit with this kind of credit type, market type idea, because you are changing land use, and then that land use change is going to stay through time. But that obviously challenges, production and the food system and everything else. So it's not like a wholesale opportunity. But again, this is a place where the conversations that we're having here hopefully generate some innovation and creativity, right? Congress needs to reauthorize the CRP. We could be thinking about, again, not that we're going to right now, but we could be thinking about how a CRP program was more connected to this set of opportunities. For example, then we got the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is going to offset some of the cost of a practice like a cover crop, or a lot of it goes into livestock, dealing with waste and manure and so forth. And so, again, how does that pair up? How do you think about, from the industry side on a credit, using that infrastructure that's already there to better implement or validate, verify the practices happening and the assumptions around carbon credit? We're seeing a little bit of that with 45Z, which is the tax credit for biofuels that's built around what's called carbon intensity scoring, which is a whole nother joyful ride through Arcana. But it is we kind of see that, right? Where they've done some early connection with some of the conservation policies and are using some of that existing body of work for the USDA and farmers. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. It takes time. And it comes back to a comment you made that I always, bore students with this point, which is that there's nothing perfect about policy. And one of the great things about working on policy is there's always something more to do. There's always things that have to be fixed and improved. We didn't think it was going to do that. And so we kind of keep iterating on it. The farm bill that typically carries these things, Congress is supposed to reconsider every 5 years. And that's a great opportunity. So, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, there may not have been this carbon market conversation the way we're having. But as Congress begins to rework these policies, can they then start to adapt a program like a CRP or an EQIP or a conservation stewardship program's got 5-year contracts? And in a healthy, functioning policy-making legislative situation, we try and incorporate that. So it works better for the farmer, it works better for the natural resource base, and we see these opportunities have a chance to grow, right? We're not going to expect them hit this right the first time out of the gate with any of this. There's no that kind of silver bullet doesn't exist, but you can certainly think about how we might be wanting to adapt these programs around the potential that this presents for farmers. Because as Andrew said from the beginning, doing this and having the ability to sell a credit is one more income stream into that acre. And we certainly know right now that every income stream into that acre would be really welcome, given the struggles that farmers are having economically and with costs and all of that. And lo and behold, some of these practices may both reduce carbon and bring in some carbon revenue and cut your costs, which, anybody's budgeting basics is going to be a benefit to the bottom line to be able to bring a little bit more revenue and cut some of the costs down on it. Or at least in some years, right? And I think that's a lot of other work around how the annual risk of the production cycle and weather and a changing climate really is going to factor into this. So I would put that plug in for the policymaking discussion to really get creative and think about how do we make adaptations or innovate within this. And at the end of the day, it's to help the farmer, right? You're helping a farmer innovate to do something more or different on that land with that acre, and we all benefit from that, right? The farmer's innovation is gonna flow through the food system and through the natural resources, the water and the air, and so it's great. It's great to see it. I think there's a big important point with this article, not to plug Andrew's work and our work together on this, but I really like. And Catherine, you've kind of teed this up, right? It can be a conversation starter. If we really want to think about, here are the struggles, here are the challenges, here are these two sets. Like when we started, we kind of debated whether to include the conservation programs in there at all. Like, was it the right fit? And then you sort of think, well, maybe that's part of the point. Like, we have to figure out how to make these things get together better and work better on the land and on the field. So, kind of a long answer to it, but there's a lot there that I think could be explored, and we'll see if we get to it.
Yes, time will tell. And I know, you talked about additionality and the issues with that, but Andrew, you had mentioned the other two aspects, which were permanence and leakage. So with permanence, could you explain that? And specifically as it pertains to farming, discuss how this issue of the many acres of leased farmland that we have, how that is a big kind of sticking point with the permanence issue.
Sure. Yeah. There are to set it up, there are three main carbon registries which will certify carbon sequestration and carbon credit generation, if you will. And they have those quality assurance mechanisms, additionality, permanence, and leakage. Permanence is different for a little, for two of the registries, it's about 40 years. And for one of the registries, they want a guarantee of 100 years. So what that means is they want the person generating the credit, the farmer, or in a lot of situations, there's a carbon crediting a third party carbon crediting company, and the registries want the third party to verify that the carbon will be permanently in the ground for either 40 years or 100 years. And it's kind of baffling to assume that would happen in an annual cropping system where you're plowing and making way for the next year's crop. And then to add a layer onto that with the leased farmland is that close to 40% of farmland in the United States is leased. And, I don't know how long the average lease is, but it's not 100 years. It's not 40 years. And so the math isn't lining up there for something like guaranteeing that this carbon will be stored in permanently in the soil for a minimum of 40 years. And so that was something that really jumped out to us, which in researching this paper and in the project in general, that especially on leased land, it's really difficult to give that quality assurance of permanence. And just on an annual cropping system, it seems virtually impossible to us to guarantee permanence. And so there's different ways that the carbon registries and the carbon crediting programs will sort of account for that. And in some cases, they'll have buffer pools, which I'm not really sure where they are or what they're doing. So it's a lot of unclarity and maybe like behind the veil. And then leakage is also a tough thing. It's more of so the idea is that if a farmer in Illinois adopts one of these conservation practices to sequester carbon, and then that results in a lower yield in their cropped acreage, that the market will make up for that lost yield in some other area by either expanding acreage or increasing tillage or something to increase the yield somewhere else. And that the carbon that was sequestered in Illinois has then leaked outside essentially to make up for that lost yield. And it's really a difficult and sort of unfavorable to the farmer. Again, it's like a really hard thing for the farmer to account for, and for even the third party crediting programs, they struggle with how to account for leakage and permanence.
See, that's fascinating, because how can whoever's looking at this put like a one-to-one relationship between those things? Like who's regulating that? Is it being regulated? So that's just fascinating to me that this is even a thing, that's like a rule, when there's no way, maybe not no way, but maybe in a very obscure, very indirect way of measuring that.
Yeah, well, because there is no federal compliance market, like we were talking about in the beginning. And so it is all these voluntary markets. And so really these carbon registries, the 3 carbon registries that we mentioned in the paper, have a lot of power and say in how carbon credit generation occurs and how it's actually credited. And so up to those registries to sort of establish equations and models to account for these quality assurance mechanisms. And it really does put a lot of power with those registries.
And these registries, this is something that, you've mentioned a couple times, your paper references the registries a little bit. What, really at the heart of it, what are they? What are they comprised of? Who makes up these registries? And is there any sort of governing body over those registries as well?
That is a really great question. There really is no governing body, but they want to, as Jonathan mentioned, they want to make sure that they have a quality credit so that their market doesn't fail. And so that's really the driving force is the market itself for them to guarantee high quality credits.
There isn't a regulatory space for it, right? It is, and that's part of why I think we see some of the challenges, like Andrew's mentioning, around getting this to fit the agricultural sector. And so it is a place. I know we are very well trained to think the word regulation is a bad word, but when it comes to these sort of things, you kind of need a referee in the game, and that's where the regulatory space can fit in, where somebody can. And the government can play that role. But right now we don't. And look, that's not necessarily to criticize this. That's a reality of something that is nearly brand new, at least in the realm of markets and whatnot, right? This is almost as close to a brand new thing. And so it just has, I think part of it, we just haven't seen it develop. And so companies, you see a lot of fascinating entrepreneurial types, like people who are starting companies up and trying to figure out how to, navigate through this. And so in some sense, we're in that really early innovative phase and stage where we haven't figured those things out. But I do think again, my opinion is that this is, it kind of begs for that. It kind of, there's a really strong argument that says, if we want to see this opportunity grow, then we're going to have some rules of the game. And we're going to have, that referee to kind of keep us in bounds and playing along in a common way that everybody can understand. So it's, like I said, the optimist would tell you, it's new, it's early, we're figuring it out, but it's not a small challenge.
And I should also mention that the USDA has done some things with voluntary carbon markets. And back in 2022, as part of the Build Back Better Act, I want to say, they also passed the Growing Climate Solutions Act, and within that they have done some research and sort of preliminary findings and requests for information, requests for comments, and things like that about voluntary carbon markets. So I will say that they have started and I'm hopeful that they will continue to do research and work into this area.
So I have one kind of closing question for you guys. Given everything that we've talked about and everything you guys discuss in your paper, if you had the power to redesign these carbon markets, totally from scratch, forget the history that's already been done, but if you could do it totally from scratch, what would you change? And how would those changes, because I assume this is the direction it would go, how would those changes make it more fair for producers, whether they're, early adopters or, newcomers into the conservation space?
Yeah, that's a great question again, and one that we asked ourselves while we're writing the paper is, what would we do better, or how would we try and make it better? And one of the things that we kept on coming back to additionality and sort of the issue, our main issue with additionality is the setting of a baseline. And we think that there's a good, a workable model within crop insurance and how farmers have to follow good farming practices and sort of have those good farming practices be the baseline for something like a carbon market and when you're trying to measure additionality. And so anything that's additional beyond these good farming practices that we already have established through crop insurance could be a way for farmers to enter a carbon market.
I'm laughing in that it's dangerous to ask me this question on a good day, but when the Senate Ag Committee has done what it did today, it sort of opens the door to a lot of thought about what better policy we could do. I think Andrew's got a good point. I think what I would build off of what he says is, okay, we have these incredible policy apparatus for agriculture, from crop insurance to conservation programs to the Title I subsidy payments, right? We've got things in place. And there's a part of me that that thinks that in redesigning something around this carbon market concept, that we'd actually go into those and figure out how to make some changes. And so crop insurance is one example. You can imagine a situation in which, you've got an insurance policy around that carbon credit and the practice, and you got to think about rating it based on the risk and so forth. I like, going back into some of the historical programs like the Marketing Assistance Loan Program, and how can we provide funding to a farmer that then is the repayment is based around how that carbon market. So if that carbon market isn't there, or the prices aren't there, that there's a struggle, then the farmer is kept close to whole in that situation. Obviously, conservation policies, as we mentioned, could be a key part of that as well. And so I think, rather than rewriting everything or starting over, we can look at what we have and begin to start to make those changes. One of the things that always has jumped out at me is like the way in which you might pair up some CRP. So if you need some certainty, with an amount, in a field, well, maybe the CRP continuous practices on a field border and a grass waterway or a portion of that field kind of gets set aside, and that's almost the reserve for that carbon contract. Like, there's ways to think about how multiple of those policy components that we have, that farmers are familiar with, that the agencies know how to operate, could be revised a bit to actually fit in here. And so the carbon contract could, you could have some more security in that for the buyer, and have the farmer really planning out how that field might maximize, again, that carbon benefit while also continuing to produce, which certainly in a state like Illinois is really a key. We're not going to see that massive land use change, we hope, given how important the state is in the general production of things food-wise. So we're not going to see that kind of massive land use change, but it could really work within a lot of those spaces. That's kind of where I go, but that maybe just out of habit as much as anything, and that we could think about, setting up a reference price for the carbon, or like adding a bonus or adding a supplemental side to what those payments are. So if you're getting $4 on the market, we might be able to set up a policy that, again, backstops, because we're talking about a lot of risk at the farm level as well as risk for the buyer of the credit. And so how do we first backstop the farmer and then think about some of these other things in the market and as best as possible coordinate? But I'd begin there. And I think I agree with you. That's the kind of question that, one, we hope people would ask in reading this article. So thank you for doing that. And that thank you for pushing that conversation forward. Like, how do we think about this? What should we be putting in place? Because ultimately, there's an opportunity here that you don't want to just lose out on. Particularly when we've seen a lot of innovation, a lot of kind of creative things in the space trying to do these markets, whether it's a company looking for it or a startup trying to find a way to help, arbitrage between these challenges. And then again, consumers are demanding. That's why we see a lot of this in the company space, where consumers they want to see it. I want to know that there's effort put into this when I buy a product. And so there is that kind of demand, and missing out on this, I think, would be really unfortunate.
Well, thank you both, Andrew and Jonathan, so much for joining me today and offering your expertise on this really fascinating topic. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us, Catherine. Thank you for, like I said, starting this conversation up. This is great.
Once again, that was Jonathan Kopis and Andrew Hockenberry with the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Be sure to join me for the next episode of Talking Crop, for which I'll be speaking with Laura Gentry with Illinois Corn. That episode will release on September 2nd. Until then, thanks for Talking Crop.